So that was just a little bit about the Cascadia subduction zone. Indigenous peoples along the coast of British Columbia have known about this earthquake zone for centuries. In fact, they've included in their history when and where these events happen and how to prepare and respond and interpret them. And they have passed this information down generationally. Let's look at the specific example of the 1700 Cascadia earthquake that coastal First Nations experienced. The maps here are of the Cascadia subduction zone, which we know is the fault spanning from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to northern California. The left image depicts the fault in its entirety, while the image on the right is giving us a more detailed visual that focuses on the northern part of the fault line. These maps depict a large earthquake that occurred in this region in the year 1700, which is why it's called the 1700 Cascadia earthquake. This black line shows the estimated 1700 rupture area. This estimation lines up with several black dots. Each dot represents the locations of Indigenous accounts of earthquakes and tsunamis around this time period. These accounts do many things. Some relay crucial information about physical events and how to respond. Elders from the eastern coast of Vancouver Island speak to the connection between the 1700 earthquake and landslides. A Cowichan elder, for example, explains that in the days before the white man, there was a giant earthquake. It began about the middle of one night, threw down houses, and brought great masses of rock down from the mountains. One village was completely buried beneath a landslide. Accounts from Indigenous peoples of Vancouver Island's outer coast speak to the tsunamis generated by the same earthquake. Louis Newcomus, also known as Louis Clamhouse, a Huaya Nuu-Chalneth elder from Vancouver Island, recalled what had happened to the people at Pachena Bay. They had practically no way or time to try to save themselves. I think it was at nighttime that the land shook. I think a big wave smashed into the beach. The Pachena Bay people were lost, but they who lived at Maltzaz, or House Up Against Hill, the wave did not reach because they were on high ground. Because of that, they came out alive. They did not drift out to sea with the others. These accounts contain information about the when and where of the 1700 earthquake, its connection to specific hazards such as tsunamis and landslides, and reasons why some people were spared while others perished. These Indigenous accounts are consistent up and down the coast, from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to Oregon and California. Thrush and Ledwin argue that through thousands of years of lived experience, the first peoples of Cascadia had integrated the seismic reality of their homelands into their most central cultural institutions. In many places within and beyond British Columbia, Indigenous peoples have cultivated what might be called a culture of hazard. Cultures of hazard are cultures geared toward solving problems, both social and non-social problems, that arise from the awareness of some form of periodic disaster threat. Cultures of hazard can be deeply embedded in a community's historical and geographical context and institutionalized through norms, values, beliefs, knowledge, technology, and narratives. As part of this culture, many Indigenous accounts are in the form of stories, which serve as memorable learning tools or heuristics connected to physical processes. They also contain lessons about morality, relationships, and reciprocity between humans and between non-human peoples and entities like water and land and the environment in general. According to many Northwest Coast traditions, for example, Earthquakes were understood, quote, as battles between enormous birds that embodied the spirit of thunder and great creatures such as whales and serpents that dwelt in the ocean's depths. For example, an elder of the Olympic Peninsula Ho people described the earthquake as an after effect of a battle between thunderbird and whale, stating, "My father also told me that following the killing of this destroyer, there was a great storm and hail and flashes of lightning in the darkened, blackened sky, and a great and crashing thunder noise everywhere." He further stated that there was also a shaking, jumping up and trembling of the earth beneath, and a rolling of the great waters. Such indigenous explanations for tsunamis and earthquakes not only manifest in stories, but also in art. For instance, here on the left, we see a piece entitled Earthquake Foot, which is a representation of a Moechahat Muchalat First Nation story told to Hesquiat artist Anilsaput or Tim Paul by his carving teacher, Ben Andrews. This story, speculated to be about the 1700 Cascadia earthquake, reads, quote, "A man was going through the mountains in Yuquat, or Friendly Cove, and stumbled across the home of two dwarves. They were very happy and outgoing. They greeted him with every respect and invited him into their home. They invited the man to perform, to dance and sing around their great drum in the house. This went on all day and all night until the man tired and stumbled into that drum. It was then that he became inflicted with earthquake foot, and every time he took a step, tremors occurred. The whole world began to shake and quake." The cultural teaching highlights the intimate relationship between humans and the natural world, emphasizing that humans are not separate from, but deeply intertwined with the land and the ocean. In many Indigenous cultures, especially within a Turtle Island context, such oral stories not only record historical events, but also teach important lessons and morals about a given society's culture, the land, and the ways in which members are expected to interact with each other and the environment. Intergenerational transmission of these stories maintains the social order and passes on ways of knowing and being. Some scholars argue that oral histories have unique qualities from written textual histories. Written stories tend to present a singular recount of a series of events frozen in time. But oral stories can exist in variations, as narrators adjust stories to emphasize particular aspects of it that are most appropriate for the context of their tellings. In this way, oral stories can be understood to function as an endeavor wherein no single narrator has exclusive authority over a story. In fact, oral stories cannot be decontextualized from the teller. Unlike textually mediated stories where there is no connection between the author and the reader, oral stories not only hold information, but also signify relationships and are key in reinforcing intergenerational relationships within Indigenous communities. To maintain the accuracy of the historical record, oral story narrators will cite the source of their knowledge, such as an elder or a relative. We've seen here a few examples of the crucial role that oral stories play in strengthening community ties and keeping disaster history alive. That's why the colonial settlers to Turtle Island were really lucky. The coastal First Nations had lived through earthquakes and tsunamis for centuries. They knew what to expect and how to minimize impact, and they had developed ways of sharing this knowledge through stories that were easy to remember. Indigenous elders from different communities did share this crucial knowledge with settlers. After all, if the settlers knew the coast was a powerful earthquake zone, they could use this information to build earthquake-resistant homes outside of tsunami zones. Thrush and Ledwin write, despite this history, most residents of the Pacific Northwest, including virtually all of the region's geologists, believed until the late 20th century that they lived on a relatively stable chunk of planetary crust? Wait. What? What? The late 20th century? I was born in the late 20th century. Well, I was born in the 80s though, so surely they don't mean the 80s. In the 1980s, some settler researchers started drawing upon coastal First Nations seismological knowledge. Western scientists began taking First Nations seismological knowledge seriously as they came to realize in the 1980s that Cascadia was a dangerous earthquake zone, like Indigenous leaders had been telling them for centuries now. By the 1980s, plate tectonic theory already existed, but researchers believed Cascadia plates slipped slowly and evenly and uneventfully. Western scholars from various disciplines finally drew upon coastal First Nations knowledges, as well as information from sediment cores, soil horizons, and tree rings and radiocarbon data to study the 1700 Cascadia earthquake. Indigenous accounts strengthened the case for region-wide megathrust earthquakes. And this knowledge is essential because the Western modern scientific lens is temporally short. Settler researchers have only been documenting Cascadia for a few hundred years at the most. Matthewman and Lambert in 2024 explain, quote, Indigenous peoples possess an accumulated knowledge of the environment, ancient, localized insights into their worlds that provide a longitudinal database of environmental hazards, fundamental to understanding how the contemporary occupation of a particular land or waterscape can or should take place. And yet for a long time, and still in many ways today, modern science dismissed Indigenous knowledges. In the case of Cascadia earthquakes, Thrush and Ledwin write, interdisciplinary inquiry resuscitated and ultimately vindicated Indigenous and local forms of knowledge, while science, which in its literalism had hitherto been deficient in its ability to grasp the metaphorical meanings of whale and thunderbird, began to catch up with Indigenous environmental knowledge. So the 1980s is a time when some scientists in Cascadia are starting to grapple with Indigenous knowledge systems. Although each Indigenous community has their own system of knowledge, we can see some commonalities between coastal First Nations disaster knowledges and those of Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, such as the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Maori worldview and knowledge system contains longitudinal observations that have been gathered over centuries and passed down from generation to generation. And these observations are abductive, emergent insights based on inference, pattern recognition, and tacit localized knowledge. So they're rooted in lived experience of many people over generations who are making a repeated observation and seeking the most likely explanation for it. This knowledge is often very specific to particular regions, not with the intention of being universal. And as we already saw with coastal First Nations earthquake stories, Indigenous knowledge systems tend to use narrative tropes and heuristics, which are not necessarily meant to be taken literally. Instead, they function as constructs that are able to communicate deeper insights in easily understood and memorable forms. And in making inferences to protect against hazards and disasters, Indigenous knowledges are often rooted in holistic and relational approaches, not extracting pieces of the earth and trying to make sense of a rock or a mineral or a piece of land on its own, but making sense of it in the context of the place it is in and how it relates to all other beings and life forms. The UN Office for Disaster Reduction argues that it is these characteristics of Indigenous knowledges that benefit risk reduction efforts.